Hey up! Right, very important video today. I've got some news for you which, to be honest, I thought would take a few more years to surface, but the government's in a rush, and the seeds were sown last week as to what their intentions are for personalised transport in the future. Basically, the right to own your own motor car or motorcycle is gradually going to be eroded through legislation over the next few years, and that's going to include electric vehicles, not just the internal combustion engine, until we are all relying on public services or subscription services in order to be able to travel to work and move around the country for any reason. And this is certainly going to have a huge impact on the lives of your children, your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. They're certainly not going to have the freedom of movement around this Emerald Isle that the likes of you and I have enjoyed throughout our lives. Now, climate change alarmism has enabled this, but it's quite clear now that this new policy is not emissions driven, it's purely political. I would just like to mention that in the last few weeks while I've been reporting on these issues, I've had a number of nasty comments and threats in the comments section, and I've also had some threats by email and through Messenger on Facebook, all from what I can only describe as eco-warriors, telling me that if I don't stop reporting about this legislation that's coming up and get with the common narrative, I'm going to be cancelled. Now, I get the feeling from these people that they've started the ball rolling and they really didn't expect it to roll in the direction that it's rolling in. I firmly believe that in some way these people are going to be vilified in the years to come for the misery that's going to ensue because of their actions. If this channel gets cancelled, it gets cancelled. There's probably not an awful lot I can do about it, but I will have a clear conscience. Before we get into the meat of what this video is all about, it was brought to my attention the other day that someone has opened up a petition to the government about the anti-tamper laws, or should I say proposed anti-tamper laws. Now, it doesn't look like this has been instigated by any organisation. I think it's just, a member of the public that's decided that he wants to do something about it, and kudos to him for doing that. But these government petitions are a bit of a double-edged sword if they're not presented correctly and they don't get the backing with actual signatures. They tend to fall flat on the face and can cause more harm than good. Now, the way it's been presented, I'm afraid it's probably not going to have much impact, even if it does qualify for a debate in Parliament. Last time I looked, it had about 8,500 signatures, which is impressive, but what we really need to do is overwhelm them with numbers. It needs hundreds of thousands of signatures. Bearing in mind that this legislative proposal will affect car drivers, not just motorcyclists. Now, I'll see if I can find the link to it and I'll leave it in the video description down below. Can I ask everybody, please, who cares about this new anti-tamper legislation, to get online, leave their signature, persuade, if you can, your wife, your husband, your daughter, your son, your aunties, your uncles, nieces, nephews, workmates, the guys you talk to in the pub to do the same. Let's please try and get as much muscle behind it as we possibly can. Right, I'm going to build a short commercial break into this video now to give you a chance to get a cup of coffee and get your feet up. And then we'll get into what a certain Transport Minister has recently disclosed about the future of personal transport. Last week, Transport Minister Trudi Harrison had this to say: "Owning a car is so last century." A patronising remark, clearly intended to make Joe Public feel ashamed, embarrassed or out of step because he or she has a motor car. Now, Ms Harrison is currently the MP for Copeland in Cumbria and was formerly the personal secretary to Boris Johnson. So we can take it that she is speaking with the authority of the government. Ms Harrison was speaking at an event held by Como UK, a shared transport charity, and to my mind it shows quite clearly that all too predictable disconnect from the reality of the real world and the imagination of politicians. Now, where this lady talks about cars, you can take it as read that she means motorcycles as well, because she made it clear later on that she was talking about ownership of personal motorised transport. Now, because of the event that she was at, she was basically talking about persuading Joe Public to car share. Something that the government tried to persuade us to do back in the 1980s and the 1990s, but it doesn't work. Colleagues that work together often live miles and miles apart, and it was discovered back in the 90s that quite often one car running around picking work colleagues up from the homes would actually generate more mileage than if they all just went in their own cars. Also, the designated drivers soon got fed up of it because it was increasing their travel time to work by about an hour a day. It's a nice sentiment, but the reality is it doesn't pass the sniff test as an across-the-board policy. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't car share if it's practical for you to do so, but in most cases it's not practical, which is why I've always advocated that small motorcycles are the way around this problem. But as I've said in previous videos, the government in this country has habitually ignored motorcycles as a possible solution. Now, although Miss Harrison did touch on emissions, it seems to me that the government is now changing its tact and going back to the old chestnut of congestion, which again is a problem that motorcycles could have solved. A bike takes up half or maybe even a third of the space that a motorcar takes up. Now we start to get to the important bit. Miss Harrison was only referring to car sharing or carpooling as an interim measure, i.e. just a way of solving or alleviating a problem in the short term, intimating that people should give up the cars and resort to walking, cycling or public transport like buses. And she says that she was aware that car ownership in rural areas was a lifeline, but the government was trying to change that. The big problem, you see, with politicians is that they think that London is the centre of the universe, when in actual fact it's just a tiny little dot in the bottom right hand corner of the United Kingdom. And the rest of the United Kingdom is not like London. We have huge expanses of countryside, rural countryside, where the nearest bus route could be miles away from individual dwellings, and the nearest train station can be tens of miles away from those dwellings. And such rural areas constitute 60% or more of the British Isles. It's clear from the context of Miss Harrison's speech that the ultimate objective is to rid the roads of personally owned transport. I will leave a link in the video description to one of the articles that refers to this speech so that you can read it in its full context. She went on to say that the government has banned the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2030. Take that to mean motorcycles from 2035 as well. But that will not go far enough to tackle emissions and congestion. And they've called for public transport, walking and cycling to become the natural first choice. Now, this is a blanket statement that confirms electric cars are never going to work. They're not sustainable. They were just a carrot dangled to get us to accept the demise of the petrol engine, and it vindicates exactly what I said in my last video. Last month in November, just before the COP26, the government quietly suspended the rollout of public charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and so far it's not been reinstated. If only half the petrol and diesel cars on the road were replaced with electric vehicles, it would mean having a public charging unit approximately every 5 metres on every residential street in the country. And in order to meet demand, current petrol stations would have to grow to the size of a football pitch, with at least 100 charge units per recharging station to cope with demand, and that is never going to happen. The government knows that only the well-off are going to be able to afford electric vehicles. So after the changeover, there are going to be substantially less vehicles on the road. And that, I'm afraid, was always the plan. What we're actually seeing here from Miss Harrison is the first subtle change in the narrative. Now, I've had an awful lot of comments from people saying, oh, this petrol ban only applies to new cars and new motorcycles. It doesn't affect the sale of second-hand vehicles. And we can easily keep those vehicles, especially the bikes, running for another 30 years after the petrol ban. Seriously, is that what you think? Because I'm going to tell you something now. The introduction of E10 has already, and is going to, over the next year or so, take a lot of older vehicles off the road. That was phase 1. Phase 2 is the anti-tamper legislation that I mentioned earlier in this video. If it comes into force as the government has proposed it, without any watering down through public pressure, that will automatically take a huge number of vehicles off the road, because they won't meet the current regulations as they will have been altered. And the first time they're taken for what will be the equivalent of the new MOT test, they will be failed and condemned. And all it will take for that to happen is a modification such as an aftermarket exhaust pipe fitted to a car because the old one rotted out, and an OEM replacement was more than the value of the car. Phase 3, as they ramp up the rhetoric, will be to start legislating older vehicles that are not of historical interest off the road, and they will probably use the Euro emissions certifications to facilitate that. The older early emission standards will be outlawed. You'll probably be offered some sort of scrappage scheme initially, but then they will set a deadline, and one by one the petrol vehicles will be taken off the road. I spoke to the Motorcycle Action Group about this a few weeks ago, and they assured me that the government has multiple tools in its armoury that it will use to get those motor vehicles off the road after the changeover. They're not going to let you keep them on the road indefinitely. Now, Miss Harrison went on to justify the removal of motor vehicles from private ownership by saying that since the 1990s, in the age group of 17 to 20-year-olds, the holding of a driving licence has dropped from 48 to 29%. What she was basically trying to say is that youngsters of today don't want cars, they don't want to drive. So there is a decline in motor vehicle ownership anyway, it doesn't matter. But what she fails to mention is that since the 1990s, birth rates have dropped slightly. And for the last 2 years, these youngsters have been under lockdown. They've been under severe restrictions in their freedom of movement. They've not been able to take driving lessons because it's been illegal. Driving instructors were effectively shut down. Testing stations were closed, and there are now huge waiting lists. So, understandably, the amount of applications for driving licence from that age group over the last 2 years will have dropped dramatically, because if they get a driving licence, there was nothing they could do with it. And that's down to the pandemic, not the personal choice of these youngsters. Which leads me on to one more thing that she said during that speech, which personally I find the most chilling statement yet. For all its devastation, the pandemic has created an opportunity for lasting behaviour change in how we go about our travel. Right, well, during the pandemic, people's travel was restricted. Is that what they mean? We shouldn't travel? I have read and reread this statement, trying to find alternative meanings. It seems to me that the government have used this pandemic as some sort of social experiment to see how far they can push us and what they can make us do. Because to me, that statement, in the context of the general speech that Miss Harrison gave to me and you, the common working man, is you don't need personal transport. You should stay at home. You should work from home. If you need to go shopping for food or clothes, shop locally and walk or use a bicycle. You don't need a car or a motorcycle. If it's too far, take the bus. But you shouldn't own a car or a motorcycle because that might encourage you to travel unnecessarily. In fact, during that speech, Miss Harrison reinforced this statement by stating that during the pandemic, congestion and emissions from vehicles dropped to almost zero because we were all locked away at home. And since the relaxation of COVID regulations, they've seen that congestion and those emissions return back to the levels of 2019. Personally, I don't think the government's intentions could be any clearer. In the future, they do not want us to have our own personal transport, and they'll do anything they can, either financially or through legislation, to ensure that we don't have our own vehicles. And this is not progress. This is a step back. It's a regression by about 100 years. Back to an era where people were unable to travel around. Weekends away, days out, holidays, as we know it, are going to become a thing of the past. And before you start shouting at me that this is not legislation, they're not going to force us to do it. This is just the first stage. It's a test to see if we're willing to swallow it. And if it goes unchallenged, they will continue to ramp up the pressure. It has effectively already started. 8 years from now, you will not be able to buy a new petrol or diesel motor car. And like it or not, electric cars and electric motorcycles will not be an economical or practical alternative. There's going to be a huge amount of lost revenue when the motor car dies. And the government's going to have to find alternative ways of getting that off your children and your grandchildren. They will pay through their noses for a far lower quality of life than we enjoy now. The government is promising that it will put the infrastructure in place with public transport in order to help this happen. But just a couple of weeks ago, they cancelled the second leg of the HS2 into the north because it's going to be too expensive. Something they promised us on the manifesto and something that would be essential for travel in the future. Tourism and hospitality, both huge industries in this country, will collapse. Prices will go through the roof because fewer people are going to be able to get to those destinations. Now, I know there are people that are going to have alternative views of what I've said today, and they're going to want to share that with me. That's fine. I sincerely hope that you're right and I'm wrong. But for those of you that can see the direction that I'm coming from here, it's time to do something about it. Email your local MP and explain to them any concerns that you might have over freedom of movement in your own country in the future. Be polite and be courteous, but be forceful. The last 2 years has seen this government ram unreasonable legislation down our throats while we've been distracted by the pandemic. And personally, I think it's time for them to take a breath and look at what they've done. These legislations that they've put in place, they don't help me, they don't help you, and they're not going to help your children or your grandchildren, nor are they going to save the planet. In fact, to be quite honest, I'm at a loss as to what they hope to achieve with this. There's a well-known phrase from a book that people keep commenting in the comment section. You will own nothing and you will be happy. A prophecy that seems to be coming true. It's a policy that's just going to hit the less well-off, which is most of the working class, and make the lives harder for them. Once again, thank you so much for watching this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for listening to me rant on for another 20 minutes. I sincerely hope the time comes when I can stop. I would of course be very appreciative if you would leave a like for this video and subscribe to the channel. I am of course going to be back next week, so until then please ride safely and I'll see you soon.